Hello, everybody. Once again, my name is Paul. I will be the host for today's webinar. I can see in my screen there are 52 who have registered and who have signed in already. I'm so happy to see so many of you joining us. This is a joint lunch talk for transformation at Changi. Derek, CBD friends, Christine, and the NBC friends. Nelson and myself are the NBC friends. Oh, just a few logistics before I introduce Max to speak to us. Max is already in the video. I'm sure you can see his face now. Yeah, first is that all of you will be placed on mute as participants, with the exception of the speakers, the host, myself, and Hendra, and the panelists. And unfortunately, we will not be able to see all of you. During this session, if you have any question, you may type in Q&A online. We will attempt to answer this question at the end of the talk. Or you can choose after the talk to raise your hand, okay, electronically, okay, raise your hand, and we will unmute you, okay, we will unmute you, and so that you can ask your question, okay. And just for your information, we will be recording this webinar. Okay, today, as I said just now, that we have Christine from our CBD friends, Derek from Transformation at Changi as our panelists, and Hendra and I are from NBC friends. We are the co-hosts for this webinar today. And most importantly, Max is our speaker today. Max, please say hello to everybody, Max. Okay, Max is the Asia-Pac Regional Director of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. Matt has spoken in banks, businesses, universities, government, and political institutions, as well as in debates and at churches and conferences. And certainly he has spoken many times in our NBC Friends lunch talk. Prior to joining Razim, Max has worked as a lawyer and a political and policy advisor in the Australian National Parliament. Max lives in Singapore with his wife, Fiona, and their 2 young children. Far from the fresh new beginning 2020 was hope that we all were hoping for, COVID-19 has delivered us an era of uncertainty, volatility, and anxiety. Amidst a viral pandemic, is there a satisfying and practical vision for the future we can put our hope in? If so, how can we find it? Let's hear what Max had to say. Let's welcome Max to the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. I just get a quick thumbs up that you can hear me okay from someone. Great. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thanks for having me. Obviously, we are all so sorry that we can't all be together physically. I would love to see all of you in person, be able to shake you by the hand and speak with you and fellowship with you, but sadly, this is the world that we are in at the moment, and so I'm so glad that we are able to come together and do this. So thank you to all of these 3 really important, vibrant marketplace groups that have come together to do this, and thank all of you for joining us. We honor your time, and we really are very grateful for you giving of your time. A lot of people think with the lockdown that everyone suddenly has all this spare time, but everyone I speak to, including my wife, and when I look at my own schedule, things have been just as busy. If not, they're just getting busier and busier. So we don't take that for granted. So thank you for joining us. I want to start with 2 quotes from outer space, if you like. The first is one of the most famous quotes from outer space, from Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon. When he landed on the moon, he uttered those infamously famous immortal words, 1969. He stepped foot on the moon and he said, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And that's kind of the line that everyone knows. It kind of reverberated across the world. And it was this enormous declaration of human achievement and human courage and independence and resilience and industriousness and all of the good things about humankind. And when we look through human history, we see a great record of achievement. We look at the different waves of the Industrial Revolution. We look at the diseases that we've eradicated. We look at the great advances in communications and technology and medicine, in biomedical science, biotechnical science, engineering, and you name it, the list goes on and on and on. there's a lot to be proud of. And so humankind has made a lot of giant leaps. The second quote came just a few minutes later from the second man on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, a good friend of Neil Armstrong's and a colleague of his. And Buzz Aldrin, when he was asked to describe what he saw on the moon, he very famously, not quite as famously as Armstrong, but very importantly, he said, desolation, magnificent desolation. Now, I think that's a very interesting partnership of quotes there, because when we look at this incredible declaration of human achievement and this declaration of desolation, I think that's where we are right now. For a long time, we have thought that we could build societies and build investment portfolios and build systems of education and wealth creation and security and stability and identity using our own strength and using human achievement. And all of us, whether we call ourselves Christian or not, we all on some level have got that idea deep down, that if we just work hard enough, apply ourselves well enough, study hard enough, then we will find the kind of fulfillment that we're looking for. So we're looking for these great moments of achievement, these great moments of motivation and hard work. Particularly here in Southeast Asia, there's no better example of societies that have built great economies on the back of hard work and application. But in the last 3 months, this viral pandemic has brought all of those mythical and synthetic constructs of human security tumbling down. And our foundations have quite literally been shaken to their very core. Doesn't matter how we look at it. And I'm not trying to be pessimistic, because I know we are all going to get through this. But if we're honest about where our minds and our hearts were, no matter what we believed 6 months ago, and the reality check that we've all been through, I think we could safely say that the blind trust in human strength and human achievement was just that, blind. And that human beings, as well as we have done, that all of the constructs that we have engaged in ourselves in building have been proven to be at the very best synthetic and weak, and at the very worst, completely fallible and completely unstable. Our economic, our financial, our education, our communications, our geographic systems, all these things that we have built over the last couple of 100 years, especially since the Second World War, they've literally all ground to a halt. They've all come tumbling down. And so it leaves us with some important questions. So how do we find some kind of a vision for peace? How do we find some kind of a vision for hope in a COVID-19 world and in a post-COVID-19 world, if in fact there ever is going to be one? That sense of conquering outer space, like we literally did in the 1960s, has now been followed up with this viral pandemic that has pointed to what many of us have neglected for too long, which is our inner space. And so finding a vision for peace in a COVID-19 world is, I don't think, so much about finding a vision for external peace out there, as correct and important as it is for us to deal with the reality of the virus and its impacts, which is what our world leaders, our frontline healthcare workers, our international NGOs, what they are all doing right now, and correctly so. That's important that we deal with that external threat. But the bigger challenge is finding a vision for inner peace, for finding a vision for peace inside. And our need for inner peace is one that predates COVID-19. It predates capitalism, it predates the world wars, it certainly predates Singapore, it predates all of us and all of our lines of ancestors. It goes right back to the beginning of humankind. That struggle for inner peace has always plagued humanity. All that COVID-19 has done is it's raised those fault lines and fracture lines of the human heart to the surface. It's just made them more obvious. And so I want to talk about 3 important realities and realizations that I think we have to think through in a COVID-19 world. One is that truth is indispensable. The second is that suffering is unavoidable. And the third, importantly, is that normality is not good enough. Normality is not good enough. We talk about getting back to normal. Well, I think that's not going to be good enough. So truth is not dispensable, suffering can't be avoided, and normality is simply not good enough. I think all those 3 things have been proven in the last 3 months. If we look a bit deeper, they've actually been proven since the beginning of humankind, but they're particularly obvious now and particularly relevant. So I just want to share a few thoughts on each of those things, and then we'll open it up for questions. So first of all, truth is indispensable. Now, this has always been the case, I think. No one likes to be lied to. A lot of people out there who say things like, I don't care about truth, or truth isn't real, or there's no way of knowing truth, or truth doesn't exist. it's all kind of lip service in a sense, because even those people don't like to be lied to. Those people don't like to be betrayed. Those people still, put their shoes on one at a time and drive to work on the left-hand side of the road. Practically, morally, truth is something that we all live by, and no one wants to be lied to about it. So when we look at the truth of what this viral pandemic has actually done, as I've already touched on, it's literally brought all of our human-made constructions of society tumbling down. Now, like I said, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think we can be real about this. The viral pandemic itself is going to pass. We may have to turn our lockdown measures on and off for the next couple of years, as most countries have come out and said in the last 24 to 48 hours. There's likely to be a pretty big economic hit that's quite obvious, that's going to touch global supply chains and the marginal propensity to spend. And so because of that, every industry at the consumer end or at the supply end is going to be hit. I think it was the Economist or the Federal Treasury projections from the United States suggest that the American economy is looking at somewhere between 13 and 20% unemployment as a result of this. And I think that's a pretty good marker, because that economy obviously is related to all of ours, but it was one of the strongest going into this. So they're looking at 13, 15, 20% unemployment. Then I hate to think what that could mean for other economies around our region and even for our own economy. And Singapore alone, we can be real about the truth of what is happening. Before the lockdown, my wife and I went out for dinner a couple of weeks before the lockdown, when things were still cautious but relatively functional in Singapore, and we were being applauded, as we should have been globally, because of the way the government is dealing with this, as one of the countries that is going to come through this the best. And still, as I spoke to the waiter at our restaurant, he said, half of my friends who work on this strip have been fired in the last week. Now, that was about 4 weeks ago, so I suspect the rest of them have been fired now. So this is a pretty big change. It's going to hit us economically. It's already hitting us medically. And I think ultimately the truth of the situation, and this is what I really want to focus on today, is that it's going to hit us existentially and emotionally, because the realization when your economic and financial and educational worlds come tumbling down, the impact of all of those things manifests emotionally. It manifests internally. All of these things that happen outside, the truth of the matter is that they all manifest inside. Now, here's the interesting thing when we consider truth to be indispensable. When we're honest with ourselves and we think about how each of us has responded to this crisis. And there's a whole spectrum of responses from people who I'm sure are out there who are incredibly resilient, have been very accepting, who have been very adaptive, who have had no problems at all with the lockdown, no problems with adjusting, no issues with their kids being at home, no issues with working from home and taking meetings. Now, I haven't met that person yet. I'm not sure that they exist, but let's say for argument's sake, they do exist. All the way to the people at the other end who are really struggling, really frustrated, struggling for social connection, struggling for human contact, struggling for that sense of inclusion and belonging, just struggling physically with not being able to go outside except to exercise and pick up essentials. Now, those responses to this viral outbreak, it's easy for us to talk about the cause of those problems as the virus itself. And yes, if not for this pandemic and the lockdown measures, we wouldn't have to go through all of this. That is true. But here's an interesting thing I'd like us to think about. In the context of the indispensability of truth, when we respond to something, either in frustration or with anxiety or in anger or with struggle, what that actually shows is what was on the inside of us before this catalyzing external event happened. So yes, it may be that this pandemic has brought out certain responses and struggles in you and I, but what we know from human anthropology and human psychology is, and we know it from the Bible as well, is that anything that comes out of us was inside of us. So if anxiety is coming out, if insecurity is coming out, it's got nothing to do with the virus. Those things were inside of us the whole time. The virus just happens to be the causative catalyst, if you like, that brought those things on this particular occasion. Paul Tripp, who's a great writer on biblical approaches to things like parenting, he identified this in the context of parenting, but it actually applies to everything. He said, if you get angry when your children does something, your children are not actually the problem. You have a problem with anger. Your children just bring that out in you. So whatever we're struggling with right now, if we want to be truthful to ourselves, the truth of the matter is that COVID-19 is not the problem. If we're struggling with something like exclusion or stability or security or identity in the middle of this, if we're struggling with the lack of options of what kind of beer is in the fridge or being able to go out and hang out with our friends in a cafe, if those things are the things we're struggling with, those are things that were internal to us. On some level, there was an internal insecurity, there were internal anxieties, there was an internal dependence on certain things that we shouldn't have had a dependence on. And now when those things have been taken away, now we are struggling. So don't get me wrong, COVID-19 is a terrible thing. And we do have to get rid of it and get past it, and I'm confident that we will. But when we look inside of ourselves, let's be honest about the truth of the way that we are reacting in some senses, in some cases. And I'm not saying this applies to everyone, but certainly applies to me. There are things about how I've responded to this that disappoint me a little bit. I'm not as resilient and adaptive and responsive as I thought I would be. There are things that I don't like about this. And there's nothing wrong with not liking things, but once we begin to struggle for security and struggle with the suffering that we're currently going through, one thing we can know for sure is that those struggles completely predate this virus. This virus is purely the catalyst. And when we are truthful with ourselves about our condition and our brokenness inside, then we begin to look outside for answers. And that's the biggest challenge we have now, because in modernity, we have been told that all of the answers are inside of ourselves. We've been told that the problems are all out there and the answers are in here. So we look at the problems out there. At the moment, it's COVID-19. Let's look inside ourselves and do what we can to get past it. But the reality of it is that it's a complete inversion of that. The problems are often right in here and the answers are out there. But they're not just in the world around us, which is as far as we usually look. They have to come transcendentally. And that's why the truth of the Christian message suddenly becomes relevant when we think about it in this way. Because Christianity purports to be both propositionally true and relationally true. It purports to be anchored in evidence. So truth is indispensable, and it's indispensable for two reasons. One is it helps us when we're honest with ourselves to see our own brokenness and our own struggle, that inner desolation that we have, whether there's COVID-19 around or not. It helps us to see the reality of the fact that we need rescue, we need stability, we need security, and we need it from somewhere outside of ourselves and outside of this world. And secondly, it offers a framework and a relationship with God through which that can actually happen. That is grounded in evidence. So truth is indispensable. Secondly, suffering is unavoidable. And that's pretty obvious. I mean, it was obvious 6 months ago, I hope, to most of us. But if not, anyone that was in denial about that should be pretty clear now through this pandemic that suffering is completely unavoidable. This virus is not one that respects university degrees. It's not one that respects passports. It's not one that respects geography or religious belief or intellect. Doesn't matter who you are or where you are. The virus doesn't really care. It's going to do what it's going to do regardless. And so all of the means by which humankind has differentiated itself in terms of building meritocracies where people that work hard do well, and certain things are rewarded, things like industry and intellect and hard work and perseverance and beauty and aesthetics and all of these things, they've all come crashing down because the virus doesn't care. Suffering comes to everyone. Now, what that then means is any response by way of a worldview is going to have to deal with the suffering. And that's, once again, always been the case. And it once again shows what I mentioned earlier, that these problems that we're dealing with are not COVID-19 problems. They have almost nothing to do with the virus in principle sense. Human suffering has been a problem since the beginning of humankind. The virus just, like I said, it catalyzes things inside of ourselves that comes out. It manifests that suffering in a new way. And admittedly, yes, physically, it does causatively bring about suffering that wasn't there before. But in a bigger picture sense, we still need exactly what we've always needed. We've needed some sense of truth to get us through the struggle and some sense of understanding of the suffering and strength and comfort through the suffering that we're dealing with. And when we look across the different worldviews, and any worldview or way of understanding the world, if you like, that purports to be taken seriously, needs to have a response to suffering. Otherwise, it's just not worth being taken seriously. And to their credit, all the worldviews do have something to say about suffering. But when you look at them, at least in categories, they begin to look a little bit either intellectually or practically inadequate. So there are some worldviews that say that, look, God does exist, but he doesn't really care about your suffering. And he owes you nothing morally. There's no sense of moral accountability both ways between you and God. So you just have to shut up and take it. There are some worldviews that say that suffering's your fault. So anyone that's going through any kind of suffering, including that caused by COVID-19, is suffering because of something they've done, either in this life or another life, maybe it's their fault. There's another category of worldviews that says that all suffering, including the suffering caused by the coronavirus, is an illusion. It's completely imagined. It's because we have desired things too much in this world. Therefore, when those things are taken away, we suffer. So if you don't care about your job and don't invest in your job, then when you lose your job due to the coronavirus, then you won't have a problem. If you don't care about your family or you don't care about your life, then when you lose a family member or lose your life, it won't pose a problem for you, or the fear of it won't pose a problem for you. And so the idea is to get to ourselves to a place where we don't desire anything. Therefore, there's no suffering. And then there's another set of worldviews which you can kind of, with some intellectual integrity, I think, categorize as the atheistic worldviews, though I acknowledge that there are several of those. But they all would say on some level that suffering is meaningless. It doesn't actually matter, because if they're honest to their worldview, everything is meaningless. We're just time plus matter plus chance. And so your suffering actually doesn't matter, whether it's caused by the coronavirus or not. Now, that's a very quick overview, obviously. I haven't gone into any depth on those approaches and responses to suffering, but none of them really, to be honest, work for me, either intellectually or experientially. But then by contrast, you look at what the Christian message says, and you see a God there that doesn't ignore our suffering. He doesn't pretend it's not real. He actually steps down into it as a person, takes all of it onto himself, goes to a cross, and acquits himself and humankind of all of this brokenness and suffering that we're all struggling with. And through that, he's able to do two things. The first is promise us, anyone that says yes to a relationship with him, to promise us an eternal future where there's no more suffering at all. But secondly, and probably more immediately importantly, through this crisis, is he's able to offer us comfort and strength through the suffering that we're going through now, whether it's job loss, whether it's family struggles, whether it's social isolation and dislocation, whether it's just a sense of emotional and existential depression and downness that we have because we're not able to go out and be together as friends and with our relatives and with our colleagues and so forth. Whatever it is, he's willing to walk with us through. Now, that's a unique response to suffering. So 2 pillars so far. Truth is indispensable, suffering's unavoidable. And to both of those pillars of realization in this crisis, the Christian message seems to provide a pretty compelling answer. Thirdly and finally, though, normality is not enough. Now, this is the biggest risk, I think, in the middle of this pandemic, is that if we think all we have to do to get through it is to just get things back to normal, if that's our mindset, then we are in big, big trouble. Primarily because we will have ignored what I said about the indispensability of truth. Because the reality is that when things were quote unquote normal, say 4 months ago or 5 months ago or 1 year ago, all of the struggles of the human heart, all of the existential needs, we were building on shifting sands. We were building them in the air on fallible and imperfect and unreliable things. Things like work, and how well our kids do at school, and how many cars we own, and how many helpers we've got, and how many degrees we've got, and what MBA we're enrolling in, or how much prestige we get from our friends because of our investment portfolios, or whatever it might be. And so going back to normal for a lot of us is a very bad idea, because normal is not good enough. This is actually a wonderful opportunity to deal with the struggles that have been on every human heart since the beginning of humankind. Those struggles now, as I said earlier, have risen to the surface. If you like, COVID-19, this coronavirus pandemic, has almost acted as some kind of a levitator of the fractures of the human soul. It's lifted them to a place where they're completely unavoidable. We used to be able to ignore them and distract ourselves from them. Well, there's only so much Netflix you can watch. There's only so many Zoom calls you can be on before you have to get real about yourself with yourself and with God, and actually be willing to accept that we need help. We need rescue from ourselves. These deepest needs of every human heart, the needs for forgiveness and for belonging and for hope and for relationship and for fulfillment and for meaning and for purpose. All of these needs, which, by the way, are not Christian needs at all. They're just human needs. They pour out of every human heart. Those needs need to be dealt with from outside our closed system. Our closed system is broken. And because of that, anything inside our closed system, whether it's the coronavirus or our jobs or our cars or our Instagram following or our Facebook feed, all of those things are just not going to be qualified to deal with the deepest existential needs that we all feel. The problem is so intrinsic and so within ourselves. The desolation, Buzz Aldrin was talking about it in the context of the moon, but that internal desolation requires a transcendental source of rescue. And that's exactly what the Christian message talks about. It talks about a God who came into this world because he knew it was broken. He knew that we were broken. He knew that we would need saving, not just from the coronavirus, but more importantly, saving from ourselves. More importantly, saving from ourselves. And so when we think about where we go from here, I just encourage you in your spare moments. Some of us do have a few more spare moments than we used to, but take that time to think about how fallacious it was to think on any level that we could be independent, that we could be, self-sufficient, that we could self-actualize, if you like. And think about our need, the truth, the indispensability of the truth of the fact that we need rescue, the unavoidability of the suffering that we're all going through now in different ways and in different manifestations. And thirdly and finally, the inadequacy of the normality that we had even before this virus hit us. This is a wonderful opportunity for perspective. It's a wonderful opportunity to step back and take a look at the bigger picture and the deeper questions. Let's not be that kind of society, that kind of family, and that kind of individual that just gets a flat tire when they're driving along and fixes the flat tire. Sometimes the tire is flat because of other issues. And sometimes if you have a flat tire, it's a good opportunity to check the engine block, check the oil levels, check the petrol, because sometimes it's something much more systematically wrong. The coronavirus is just, a seasonal and momentary difficulty, a set of difficulties. And admittedly, I don't want to downplay it at all. It is a terrible and horrible thing, and I'm glad that we're all working together to defeat it. But let's be very clear with each other. This coronavirus represents nowhere near the challenge of inner desolation that we all have if we try to fight this thing and we try to save ourselves from ourselves to try and cater to the needs of every human. The only place I think you can find that is in the person of Jesus Christ. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for trusting us with your time. I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
Thanks, Max. Well, that was really a very enlightening speech. I like, especially when you were saying that through this COVID, what is inside of us is coming out. And how we're responding is actually a reflection of what is inside of us. And for all the participants, so if you have any questions, please type it under the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and we will unmute you. But my first question to you, Max, is this: that if someone who has through this COVID-19, and as you have said, and I fully agree with you that what is inside of us is coming out, and he recognized the need for God, what would you say to him? What would be the next step that you will encourage him to do?
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul, for your kind comments and encouragement, and for that question. It's such an important question, because I think there are a lot of very, very intelligent people that would have that question and postulate it. So I want to deal with it carefully. And I think the thing I would say is that, just like with anything that we go through, we can try and get through it without God. It's always a choice that we have to throw God out of our lives, out of our frame of understanding the world, and try and deal with things in our own strength. The danger with that is it leaves us with nothing but our own strength to get through this. And look, that's the point I think I was making on the indispensability of truth and the unavoidability of suffering. We might be able to get through this COVID-19 crisis, but the deeper existential needs of the human heart are always there. And there is no way that anything inside this world can deal with those. And we have good examples from that. Our data set for that is very sad and powerful. We are more intellectually financially, academically, and educationally advanced than we've ever been before in human history. And yet the deepest markers of human flourishing are going backwards, or at the very least not going anywhere. There's more suicide than ever before. There's more homicide than ever before. There's more sex and pornography addiction. There's more depression, anxiety, social dislocation, social exclusion. All of these things are at all-time highs. So what that says to me, I think, in a collective sense at least, is that we need something beyond ourselves to get through these things. Not just the coronavirus, but the deeper emotional needs that flow out at a time like this. We need more than ourselves. Now, I've just given an answer in a collective sense. I think for the questioner, if they are honest about where they are personally and privately, I think they will see those same existential needs. To see them collectively as a society is obvious. The data is completely undeniable. It's very obvious. But certainly as I look at my life, and I think as we all look deep inside, that magnificent desolation that Buzz Aldrin talked about, it's on some level on every one of our hearts. We all have that desolation that needs to be dealt with. And if we throw God out of the picture, then we are stuck dealing with it on our own. And that literally will eat you alive. It will drive you crazy. I mean, Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the greatest intellects that happened to be an atheist as well, he literally died insane because of that. It drove him to it because there was nowhere left to look when he tried to find solutions to humankind's problems in his own strength.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Max. Oh, we have a few questions that came in. I'm going to ask them to you. And then after that, we will maybe also ask Christine and
please.
Derek and Nelson to make a few comments. Oh, first is this, from eating, she asked this, I like what you say. What we are struggling with now is a reflection of what has been going on inside of us. Very similar to what I was commenting just now. How would you respond to struggles with tangible circumstances? For example, increase in workload. You know, how do you respond to, because of this, there's more workload and that is a struggle that you also have to work with, you know?
Yeah, look, thank you for that question. It's very practical. I've been talking very existential and big picture, and so that makes these issues very real and very practical. The way to look at this, in my view, is to, first of all, have an existential foundation that transcends your work. And so for those of you who would call yourselves Christians and are followers of Jesus, you have that because you have what I've been talking about. You have that source of security and stability. And so when anything inside the world becomes difficult, as it often will, because we are broken and the world is broken. And so, you know, employees and people on your team, colleagues will become difficult. People will treat you unfairly. Workloads will go up and down. We'll have unfair deadlines. The economy will do terrible things. The bottom line won't add up. All of these terrible things will happen. When those things happen, if you have that existential foundation that's anchored in God outside of this world, then at least it won't phase your stability and your identity as a person. So when these things happen, the worst that can happen is that they just kind of make life a little bit difficult in the surface day to day. So that's the first point. If the foundations are strong existentially, then these things won't drive you to not be able to sleep at night and be really struggling with your identity. So that's the first. The second thing I think is, well, how do you actually deal with it? How do you actually deal with, you know, an increased workload? And I think the Bible is interestingly quite motivating and encouraging. It doesn't actually give you a parachute to escape out of it. What it says is, it calls you to excellence. It actually says, look, it says, don't be a doormat, but if things do change and things become difficult, you are called to rise up. And so I don't want to sound like an executive coach or a life coach, but these are tough times. And, you know, we have this saying that I used to think it was Australian, but more and more when I come out and say things are Australian, it turns out that they're not. They've been said by everyone. But in Australia, we often say, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And so the going is tough right now. It's tougher than it's been for a long time, probably in 4 generations. And so it's up to us now to dig deep and to rise up professionally, to rise up intellectually, to rise up emotionally, and to rise up supportively and encouragingly for those around us, to pour out not just the love of Jesus, but the excellence to which we have been called as followers of Jesus at a time like this. And I think that obviously gets manifest in different ways. It gets manifest in prayer and in love and in compassion and in empathy, but it also gets manifest in how we deal with the professional struggles and the day-to-day mechanical struggles of this pandemic. And so the difference is that when a Christian digs deep, when they look inside themselves and dig deep, they have the power of God inside of them. They have the heart of Jesus inside of them. So we should be able to apply that in the context of our diligence, in our professional excellence, in our professional ethics, in terms of how we deal with annoying things like workload and deadlines. But ultimately, we can do our best knowing that, how well our work goes, our identity and security doesn't depend on it, that we can get on with things. If we were all to lose our jobs in the next 1 week, those of us who are Christians should be able to say that that would be terrible and it would phase us emotionally, obviously, and financially, obviously, but it wouldn't phase us intellectually, existentially, sorry. It wouldn't phase us in terms of our meaning as a person. I hope that's a few helpful things to think about.
Thanks, Max. Oh, Christine, maybe I pass the time to you.
Hi, thanks, Max. Sharing from a personal point of view, as a Christian, I know that my life here is temporal, and my future, I have that eternal promise and that eternal life with God. And so my life in this world, I do my best to really live a life that's worthy of Him, where I'm able to have a positive impact on the people around me. And in challenges like this, and I can't begin to even understand many who are suffering because they've lost their jobs or they're struggling for that next meal, is the hope that, I can cling on to, that there will be something better. And that, at the end of the day, I can try my best, but at the end of the day, it is not my own effort that's going to get me out of this, that there is someone bigger who knows more, who knows better. But, then Max, in terms of, the reality, right? Like what was said earlier, we talk about God giving us the peace. How would you explain how He understands what we're going through, the different types of challenges that we have, from job to, thinking about your next meal, illness and sickness and the whole range of suffering? How does God understand all this?
Thanks so much for that, Christine. It's nice to see you and hear your voice as always. I'm really glad you asked that question, because my answer to the previous question could have seemed a little trite and a little insensitive if it wasn't followed by the answer to this question. Because obviously I completely echo and affirm the preface to your question. And just to flesh that out slightly, we followers of Jesus have seen the end of the movie. We know that it ends well. We have an eternal perspective. We have this hope for an eternal future beyond the suffering. But the reality of the situation now is that there is suffering. It's still real, and we don't want to downplay that. And that's not what I was trying to do at all, and certainly what God does not do. He doesn't say, oh, look, just suck it up. It's going to be fine. This is just 80 years of life, 70, 80, 90 years of life, and then we're going to have eternity and it's going to be fine. That's not what He says at all. So the answer is that God understands exactly what we're going through. He understands the brokenness of the world, and He understands the brokenness of humankind. And all suffering is caused by some combination of those two things, or either of those two things, either my brokenness or our brokenness as people, or the world's brokenness. That's the cause of all suffering, including the coronavirus. So what God says is that, yes, there is an eternal future with no more suffering, but now I want you to grab a hold of my hand, and I want us to walk through this suffering. And the question that I would then ask of God, or I think the right thinking skeptic would ask of God, is, what would you know about this kind of suffering? What puts you in the place to be qualified to even be talking to me about this suffering, let alone for me to trust you in the middle of this suffering? And that's when God would smile at us and say, because I've been there. I've experienced suffering beyond all of this kind of suffering. And the amazing thing about God is he experienced suffering that was infinitely greater. On the cross, when he came and died for us, he experienced suffering that was infinitely greater. And yet, in a comparative sense, he doesn't belittle our suffering. He doesn't say, well, this is nothing compared to what I went through. He says, no, it's because of what I went through that I know exactly what you're going through. Literally, he didn't even experience it in a third person way, in terms of a way that a creator would, be able to empathize with something his creation was going through. He literally stepped into the creation as a person and experienced it in full empathy. So this is not a God who sympathizes with our suffering. This is a God that empathizes with our suffering, and that's much more powerful. And so he's willing to walk with us through this suffering. And the best way I've heard it put is that, when we are in a storm, we can call out to God in the middle of that suffering because he understands what that's like. And he will do one of two things. He will either calm the storm, or the storm will continue to swirl and he will calm you within the storm. And so I think this is a God who empathizes. He's compassionate. He understands. He's defeated suffering. He's experienced suffering. So he's more qualified than anyone you could possibly imagine to be able to help us through this, and more trustworthy because of what he did for us and what he proved of himself in living and dying and rising again from the dead as a person, to be able to walk with us and then redeem the suffering in the long term. The final thing I'll say, which is an important kind of annex to your question, Christine, is that in the middle of this suffering, it's not just a question of holding on to God. People who call themselves Christian and who would claim that they are followers of Jesus, we have a responsibility to pour out that same love that God showed, yes, in an imperfect and in a broken way, but to pour out that love on those around us who are suffering. And so there's no greater opportunity than now for followers of Jesus to be showing the love of God to those who are suffering more than we are. And I know that there are people on this call who are suffering tremendously. You might have lost a loved one to COVID. You might have lost someone close to you to COVID. You might have lost your job. You might be about to lose your job and you just don't know it yet. I think we're all in that position, if we're honest with ourselves. Everyone's lost money. Anyone that's in the stock market has lost money. Everything's at risk right now. And so now is a time for Christians, even in the midst of all of that, even being affected by that themselves, for us to actually stand up and step up and support local businesses and support, migrant workers, and, pray for our leaders and pray for our frontline health workers and pray for people in other countries that don't have two sovereign wealth funds like we do, that we can just dip in and have a stimulus budget. Pray for, all of those people around our city and around the world who are suffering more than we are suffering. To get alongside each other and to pour out that kind of selfless, sacrificial love that God showed us. Now is the time for Christians to practically do that. And there are lots of great ways, I think, that we can do that. And I'm not one to tell people what to do, but, maybe when you're going to a hawker center to pick up some food next time, maybe just pay them double or triple what the cost of the food is. Maybe just when you're paying people in the cash economy who don't have salaries, who are literally living day to day, maybe just tip them 2 or 3 or 400%. We know we can do that. We know that we've been blessed so much to be able to do that. Maybe if you're living in a condo and there's a Facebook or a WhatsApp group in the condo, find out if there's anyone that's a bit older that needs prescriptions picked up, or that needs a loaf of bread or some milk brought to them every few days, and do that. Maybe if you've got non-Christians in your friendship groups, as you should have, and if you don't, you need to get them and get them quickly. Ask them how you can be praying for them. So this is a God who will get us through the suffering, and he'll give us comfort and strength through it. But he also expects of us as followers of Jesus to help others get through the suffering too. And in doing so, point back to him. So thank you for that question.
Yeah. Thanks, Max. So we have quite a number of questions. So we will need a little bit of shorter answer from you in certain ways.
Okay. I get that a lot.
Yes, talking about migrant workers, I believe that this was, I'm sure that we all follow the news that the migrant workers now, there are so many of them that unfortunately contacted COVID virus. And this is probably a related question. It says this, that the more worrying segment of society who lives hand-to-mouth assistance, spiritual health check may be a luxury to them. How can we reach out to this group? I think it possibly could be relating to the current trend that's happening in Singapore, But I'd like to throw off two other related questions to you so that you can answer them all together. Is this,
Yep.
how do we convince someone that we need God in our lives? He's not just a nice to have in times of crisis. Or is this something we can pray about that they will ultimately have to realize it for themselves? So it's kind of related, you know. Of course, first one is more of the people who struggle even with daily living, you know, and then how then can we show them that need? And the last question, related question, is a lot of non-believer also treat their God like a vending machine. What is the best way to our relationship that Christianity has to them? What would be the difference, you know? So we also do not want to present to those who are struggling with livelihood to say that now you have a God, you have a vending machine, you got it, you got the solution, you know.
Yeah.
Back to you, Max.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul, for those 45 questions you just asked me in one time. I'm going to try and answer them all in 1 minute. Look, I think the main thing that I want to point back to briefly is my third point, that normality is not enough. And so I think all of the answers to all of the questions grows out of that. And so spiritual inner peace and existential peace is the one thing that doesn't need to be a luxury. You know, in this world, everything is negotiable. And we've built some broken systems politically, economically, socially over the last 750 years. And because of that, a lot of people do struggle. And there are good political debates about what the best ways of structuring society economically and what the best government policies are and so forth. And we should continue to have those discussions and debates. But regardless of how successful someone is economically, or how much they are struggling financially, or how sick they are physically, the existential need for rescue is exactly the same. So this is the one thing that I've been talking about that applies to everyone, to migrant workers, to non-migrant workers, to the expat that's making $700,000 a year, you know, at an investment bank, all the way through to the helper who's making $600 a month, you know, working in the same city, working for that expat perhaps. They're both equally broken inside. They're both equally in need of that existential rescue. So there's no issues there. We can still take the love of Jesus and point to that need for rescue to the migrant worker, just like we can take it to the cabinet minister, just like we can take it to the billionaire or the millionaire, because we're all equally in need of it. The question of what makes people want to need that or be aware of that, like I said, right now, it's just more obvious that we need something beyond ourselves. And so I think we could present the hope of Jesus and the love of Jesus as part of that. But we also, as I said in my previous answer, have to be, you know, doing what we can to provide them with their material needs as well. And that the love of Jesus comes spiritually, but it also comes materially. That being said, getting to the final part of the question, our God is not a transactional God. He's not about simply material transactions. He's a relational God. He's about dealing with what's in here, not so much what's out here. That's not to say that he doesn't answer prayers when we ask for material things, but the most important point to get across to people that might ask like that is that this gospel is relational. It's not transactional. It's not to deal with the material needs in your life, although Christians are called to help deal with those, and as Christians we should be reaching out to those who need things materially, but it's there to save us from ourselves, to save us from our deep existential needs for belonging, for dealing with the guilt and the shame and the brokenness in this life and the next.
Thanks, Max. Let me ask another two questions before I pass the time for Derek to say a few words.
Sure.
This is I believe you have talked through it, but I will still raise the question. It says this, that the common question for non-believer is that God is loving. Why does he allow COVID?
Yep.
You know? And related to this question is, well, it is opportunity, of course, to be introspective, to process the feeling that we have in this season, which you mentioned earlier. Still, the question is this, how should we understand COVID at all? Why the scale, the suffering, the death, the isolation, the economic disruption and devastation that comes along with it? You know, so yeah, back to you, Max.
Sure. look, I'll deal with the second part of the question first. As some of you know, I used to be a lawyer, and if I was defending God's case in a court of law against COVID, it would actually be very, very easy, because COVID was caused by us, completely by human activity. So the moral responsibility for COVID is entirely on humankind. So the whole question of why did God bring this about in a causative sense is actually a little bit laughable. I would close my case after about 3 minutes of just explaining that, well, we did it. And not just that, we collectively, in so many ways, have been throwing God out of every institution and aspect of human existence for many hundreds of years now. We threw him out of our governments, we've thrown him out of our schools, we've thrown him out of our homes, we've thrown him out of our hearts. And then, we have the moral hypocrisy and audacity to say to God, where are you in this? This thing that we actually made. So that would be me defending it on God's behalf, which he doesn't need me to do. So I think God's completely on safe ground here in a very human, legal, moral way, for starters. But let's pretend for a second that he's not. And he's such a good God and such a gracious God that he actually gives us much more than the answer I give. But if I was him, I'd give that answer, and that would be the end of the story. God gives us something much richer. What God says is that this is actually just another symptom of a broken world and broken humankind. And so I think that's a healthier way to understand COVID-19. It's a symptom of a creation that is imperfect and people within it who are also imperfect. So we don't need to actually know exactly how it happened or why it happened. We can just know that it happened and that the Bible diagnoses the brokenness of humankind and the brokenness of creation correctly. Now, the second question, which is a fair question, is if this God is all loving and all powerful, why doesn't he stop it? Because regardless of how it came about, if this God is who he says he is, then he does have the power to stop it. And I believe that he does. He is completely sovereign. And yet he's let it go for this long with all of this damage. Even if it is man-made damage, he has let it go for all of this time. Now, this is where God says something very interesting. He says two things that humankind really struggles with. He says, I am God and you are not. And if those two things are correct, if he is in fact God and we are not, then there is something that we would expect in terms of what the philosophers call epistemic access, which means there are certain things that we are capable of understanding about reality, and there are other things that we are not capable of understanding. If God is real and he is so much greater than us, which he is, and we are real and we are so much less than him, which we are, then cognitively, we are necessarily limited in what we can understand of God. So even in our understanding of God, there are things that we can't fully fathom. And in the Bible, the best language that talks about this is when God says, his ways are higher than our ways. Now that makes perfect sense. If that wasn't the case, then he wouldn't be God. If I understood everything about him and everything about everything that was happening, then he wouldn't really be worth worshiping. He wouldn't really be a God because I'd be at his intellectual level. But that's not the case. The reality of who we are and who he is such that there are lots of things that we just simply don't understand because even cognitively, we don't have the cognitive capacity to understand. In the same way that if I tried to explain multivariate calculus to my 2-year-old son, he just wouldn't understand it. It's not that he's stupid. It's not that he's not engaged. It's not that he might not even try to understand it. He just doesn't have the cognitive capacity to understand it. Now, there are so many things in God's reality and in the entirety of what would be considered reality that we just don't understand because of our cognitive incapacity, because of just who we are, because of the fact that our ways are so much lower than his ways. Because of that, God says one thing. He says, I need you to trust me. I need you to trust me. Now, what the skeptic should ask of a God that asks us to trust him is, okay, God, on what basis should I trust you? On what basis should I trust you? That's a good question. That's a really good question. And the beauty of this God, like I said, is that his truth and this offer of relationship that he gives us and the whole Christian story, the Christian message, it's anchored in sufficient evidence that forms a reasonable basis on which we can trust him. So he acknowledges that there are things that we don't understand, why they happen, or from where they came, maybe like the coronavirus. He says in the middle of that, I want you to trust me. There are unknowns. I need you to trust me with those unknowns. And when we say, on what basis should we trust you? He says, here is all the evidence of who I am. And there's the Bible, there's the textual evidence, there's the historical evidence, there's the archaeological evidence, there's the philosophical evidence, there's the anthropological evidence, there's the cosmological evidence. And on top of all of that, there's the anecdotal and relational evidence that each follower of Jesus has in their own hearts and in their own relationship with Jesus that are walking around. So God gives us more than enough evidence on which to trust him. And the whole point of trust is that it acknowledges incomplete information. If you knew everything there was to know, you wouldn't have to trust in anything. I don't need to trust that 2 + 2 = 4. I know that deductively. Whereas when you want authentic relationship as God wants us to have with him, and because of our smallness, he's saying there's going to have to be an element of trust because there's incomplete information because you guys just don't get it and you're not going to be able to get it. And so in the meantime, before we get to that point where you will be able to understand on the other side, I need you to trust me with the unknowns. And thankfully, this God loves us so much. He's given us more than enough evidence in the light so we can trust him in the dark. And it is dark at the moment. Don't get me wrong. I know it's dark out there, but we know a light that shines in the darkness, and a darkness cannot overcome it. Thanks so much for having me. God bless you all.
Yeah. Thanks, Max. Oh, I know it's 1 o'clock already, and we should be ending this session. Oh, but if you were to, for those who need to sign off, please go ahead. We will definitely keep you informed of the next lunchtime webinar through the contact you have through us. Okay, but I thought we could keep you, Max, for another 5 to 10 more minutes. Okay,
Sure,
I've unmuted Katie McKinley. Maybe you would like to ask that question. So what about the digitized world thing, Katie?
Hi, thanks so much for taking the question. My husband Patrick and I are listening together, so I'll let him speak the question.
Oh, great. Thanks, Katie.
Hey, Max. This is Patrick. So I just have a question. And we've been sharing some positive Christian views of this pandemic on social media. And we do have some friends who are non-believers who don't share the same positive Christian views as us. So if they have some questions or if they turn against us during this situation, how do we handle this?
Look, I think at a time like this, Patrick, first of all, thank you so much for the question. Very practical, very important. The most important thing that we all should be doing all the time, not just at a time like this, but especially at a time like this, is loving people. Loving people in suffering is much more important than actually bringing propositional truth in suffering. Though the questions in the midst of suffering are often propositional questions, like why is this happening? Why would a God allow this? How could your God let this happen, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's important to first respond in love. So just continue loving them. I know that's difficult, but remember, we have access to this unique brand of love of God that is capable of stuff that we are not capable of. So for human beings, it's very difficult for us to love anyone that doesn't love us back. But remember, this is the kind of love that God was showing, where he loved even those who hated him and who continue to reject him. He still loves them. So come alongside them. Love them in the most Christian way that you possibly can, because the best glimpse of Jesus that they are probably going to get is through the two of you. So that's the most important thing. Secondly, I think you can be intellectually engaged and caring enough to actually welcome their questions, to actually say, look, that's a really good question. I appreciate you asking me that. Let me come back to you with an answer. And, to the best of your capacity, try and find an answer to that question. Maybe speak to your friends, maybe pray about it, maybe come up with some resources that you can connect them with. I mean, that's actually why we are here at RZIM. Feel free to get on our rzim.asia website. We have links to our various resources. We have articles, short YouTube clips that covers, pretty much all of the questions that people ask. So you don't have to know the answers to all of the questions, but together, as a family, as a global Christian family, we have all of the answers one way or another. So love them as best you can, take their questions seriously, but don't feel pressured to respond to every objection, especially the hostile ones. Just kind of absorb them in love. And if there is a question somewhere amidst the hostility, then try and fish that out for them and say, look, I know you're upset. I just wanted you to know that, we care for you. We love you through this. If there's anything we can be praying for or doing for you, we would love to be able to do that. But your question sounds like you were asking about this. I know you were angry, but it sounds like you were asking about suffering, or you're asking about freedom. Let me come back to you with an answer to that question. I think how you treat them is probably even more important than the content or the substance with which you give back to them in terms of answering a question. So I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Max, and thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I know we saw you 1 or 2 times at our NBC lunch talk when we have to be able to meet in person, you know. But it's unfortunate at this point in time we're having webinar like this. Yeah, I can see the attendance. The participant has the number has come down already. I think people are really starting to leave for the webinar. So I think I really wish we can have a lot more time to talk about this. But I understand that people need to go back to work, you know, talk about work overload and a lot more things to do, you know, with this COVID, you know. So once again, we'd like to thank you, Max, for speaking to us in this webinar. And thanks all the participants for joining us. And please look out for an email invite from us for the next lunchtime webinar. Okay. Thank you very much, Max, and thank you very much for those who participate. Thank you.
Thank you. God bless. Have a safe lockdown, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Max. Thanks, Paul.